The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's ICU flickered as Eleanor pushed through the double doors at 10:47 p.m., 3 minutes before her shift officially started, but she had learned years ago that being early meant catching the tail end of report without the chaos of actual handover. The antiseptic smell hit her like it always did, sharp and clinical, a scent she had long since stopped noticing consciously, but that somehow lived in her clothes, her hair, the back of her throat. She dropped her bag in her locker and was tying her dark hair back when the ambulance bay doors burst open and everything accelerated into crisis. Private ambulance, the expensive kind with leather seats and discretion built into the price. And two paramedics wheeling in a man on a gurney with the particular urgency that meant something had gone very wrong very recently. Eleanor moved on instinct, falling into step beside the gurney, taking in details with the quick assessment that had become second nature. Male, mid to late 30s, well-built, post-ictal state following grand mal seizure, according to the lead paramedic who was rattling off vitals. But it was the other details that snagged her attention. The clothes were expensive, the kind of expensive she only saw in magazines. A black button-down shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent, now rumpled and sweat-soaked. Tattoos curved up his neck, disappearing into his collar, intricate designs she did not recognize, but that triggered some primal unease in her gut. His face was all hard angles and dark stubble. Jaw clenched even in unconsciousness, a face that would be handsome if it did not look so dangerous. No medical history provided, the paramedic said. Patient gave name as John Blake. No known conditions. This was his first documented seizure, though he indicated there had been others. Dr. Catherine Wentworth appeared, her silver hair perfect even at this hour, her expression unreadable as she glanced at the patient and then away too quickly. "Get him into bed 3, she directed, and then to Eleanor specifically. "You will take him, primary nurse, full monitoring, no other assignments tonight." Something in her tone made Eleanor's instincts scream, but she nodded and followed the gurney into the private room at the end of the unit, the one they used for VIPs and people who needed discretion. She was reaching for the BP cuff when his body went rigid. "Seizure," she called out, already moving, her hands going to support his head, turning him to his side, protecting him from the bed rails. Someone handed her padding and she cushioned his skull, watching the terrible jerking of his limbs, counting seconds in her head. 40 seconds, 50. His hand flung out and she caught it without thinking, held it firmly, her thumb pressing against his racing pulse. "It is all right," she heard herself murmur. "You are safe. I have you. Just breathe. Let it pass." Stupid things to say to someone actively seizing, someone who could not hear her. But the words came anyway, soft and steady. The seizure broke at 63 seconds, and his eyes opened. Direct hit, his gaze finding hers with such sudden, startling intensity that her breath caught. His eyes were gray, storm gray, and they locked onto her face with a focus that seemed impossible for someone who had just seized, searching, assessing, almost predatory. Something in that look made her stomach flip, attraction and warning bells ringing simultaneously. His hand in hers tightened briefly before going lax and his eyes closed again. Dr. Wentworth was beside her suddenly, voice low. "This patient is VIP, Eleanor. No questions asked. Do you understand? Full discretion. Everything he requests within medical reason. Someone very important wants him taken care of." The way she said important made Eleanor's skin prickle. She nodded. Dr. Wentworth left, and Eleanor busied herself with the monitoring equipment, IV access, standard post-seizure protocol, hyper-aware of the man in the bed, the strange pull she felt toward him. Through the window she could see 3 men in the waiting room, all wearing dark suits despite the hour, all with the same watchful alertness, the same controlled danger in how they held themselves. One met her eyes through the glass and she looked away quickly. They claimed to be his cousins according to the chart, but nothing about them suggested family in any normal sense. Her hands were steady as she checked his vitals, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct she had honed growing up in a neighborhood where you learned to spot danger early was screaming that this man was trouble, that whatever she was stepping into was far beyond a simple medical case. But when she looked back at his face, relaxed now in unconscious vulnerability, she remembered the way he had gripped her hand, the strange desperation in that storm-gray gaze. She adjusted his pillow gently and told herself she was just doing her job. The hours crawled past midnight, vitals stable, no further seizures, the man who called himself John Blake sleeping under her watchful monitoring. She checked on her two other patients, both stable, both routine, then found herself drawn back to bed 3. At 2:18 a.m. she entered quietly to check his IV site and found him awake, those gray eyes tracking her movement across the room. She smiled professionally, reached for his wrist to check his pulse manually, and his hand whipped out faster than she could process, gripping her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly hard and cold. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice rough from the seizure but cultured underneath, educated, each word precisely formed. Eleanor's heart stopped. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. I am just your nurse, Eleanor stammered, her wrist still caught in his grip, feeling the controlled strength in his fingers. The way he held her firmly, but without real pain, like he knew exactly how much pressure to apply. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, like he was reading every thought she had ever had, cataloging her fears and intentions, and she forced herself to meet that gray gaze steadily, even though her heart was trying to break through her ribs. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, something in his expression shifted, the hardness easing fractionally, and he released her wrist with a muttered apology that sounded rusty, unpracticed. "I apologize," he said, his voice still rough, but she could hear the cultured edge underneath. The kind of voice that came from expensive schools and careful breeding, each syllable precisely formed despite the obvious pain he was in. Post-seizure confusion, paranoia, I should have expected it. She rubbed her wrist more from nervousness than actual hurt and launched into her professional explanation, telling him about his condition, the seizure he had experienced, the need for comprehensive testing, MRI and EEG and full neurological workup, blood work to check for underlying causes, medication to prevent future episodes. He listened with that unsettling focus, then shook his head once, definitive. "No tests that require identification, no records that leave this hospital, basic monitoring only." Eleanor felt frustration rise in her chest, the familiar annoyance she felt when patients refused care that could save their lives. But it was tangled with fascination, because even lying in a hospital bed, clearly in pain and vulnerable, he radiated authority, the kind of presence that expected obedience. "Mr. Blake," she started, but he cut her off with a slight gesture of his hand. "Just John," he said, and even that felt like a lie on his tongue. She tried again, explaining the medical necessity, the dangers of untreated seizure disorder, but he was immovable, a wall of polite refusal, and she found herself studying him as she argued, the hard line of his jaw, the tattoos that curved up his neck in patterns that seemed almost familiar now that she looked closer, the expensive watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her yearly salary. She was preparing another argument when his body went rigid again, and she moved without thinking, already reaching for him as the seizure took hold. This one was shorter, 41 seconds by her count, but no less violent, his body jerking against the restraints of his own muscles, and she supported his head, turned him to his side, held his hand and murmured those same useless, comforting words. "You are safe. I have you. Just breathe. Let it pass." When it ended, he did not open his eyes immediately, his breathing harsh and labored, his hand still gripping hers, and she let him hold on, let him take whatever comfort he needed. His eyes finally opened, and there was something different in them now, something softer, almost wondering, as he looked at her. "Thank you," he said quietly, and the sincerity in those two words hit her harder than his earlier suspicion. The door opened and a man entered, tall and broad-shouldered with light brown hair and the same watchful alertness as the men in the waiting room. But this one moved with even more purpose, more authority. He took in the scene, Eleanor standing beside the bed still holding the patient's hand, and his expression flickered with something she could not read. "Mr. Blake," the man said, and it was clearly not a question, more of a statement, a reminder of the role they were playing. "Alexander," the patient said, his voice firm despite his exhaustion, and the newcomer nodded once. "This is James Sinclair, my associate." Eleanor recognized the careful distance in that word, associate, the way it could mean anything and nothing. James moved closer, his eyes on Alexander with obvious concern, beneath professional composure. "We need to discuss the Redmond situation," he said quietly, and Eleanor saw Alexander's jaw tighten. "Not now," Alexander said. James leaned in, lowered his voice but not enough. "The deadline is in 48 hours. We cannot afford to wait." She pretended to busy herself with the monitors, adjusting things that did not need adjusting, but she felt Alexander's eyes on her, assessing whether she was listening, whether she was a threat. She kept her face carefully blank, professional, just a nurse doing her job. James said something else too quiet for her to hear, and Alexander responded with a slight shake of his head, then seemed to regret the movement, pain crossing his features. James straightened, looked at Eleanor directly. "Take good care of him," he said, and it sounded like both a request and a warning. She nodded, waited until James left before turning back to her patient. Alexander was watching her with that unreadable expression again, and she wondered what he saw, if he knew she had heard, if it mattered. "You should rest," she said, reaching for the medication cart. He caught her hand again, gentle this time. "Eleanor," he said, and hearing her name in his voice did something strange to her pulse. "Thank you for your care. I know I am not an easy patient." She managed a small smile, told him to rest, and left the room feeling his eyes on her back until the door closed between them. Her shift ended at 7 a.m. and she drove home to her modest apartment in a neighborhood that was trying hard not to slide into decay, climbed the 3 flights to the studio she shared with rotating roommates, currently a nursing student named Maya, who was thankfully at clinical. She should sleep, she had another shift in 12 hours, but instead she found herself opening her laptop, searching seizure disorders, trying to understand what was happening to the man who called himself John Blake. She read about epilepsy and brain tumors and traumatic injury, about medication protocols and warning signs, absorbed information with the focus she usually reserved for studying for certifications. Then, because she could not help herself, because something about him nagged at her instincts, she searched for John Blake and found nothing useful, too common a name. She sat back, chewing her lip, thinking about expensive clothes and armed guards, and the name Redmond spoken like a curse. She typed gang violence recent into the search bar and skimmed through articles about territory disputes and drug trafficking. And then she saw it. A photograph from 2 weeks ago, blurry and taken from a distance, showing men in suits outside a restaurant moments before a shooting, and one of them had the same build, the same dark hair, the same way of holding himself that made her mouth go dry. She stared at that photo until her vision blurred, telling herself it could be anyone. The image was too unclear to be certain, but her hands were shaking as she closed the laptop. Eleanor returned to the hospital at 10:39 p.m. for her next shift, arriving early again by habit. But this time her mind was anything but clear. Tangled up in that blurry photograph she had found, the one that might be her patient, or might be someone else entirely, and she told herself as she walked through the familiar corridors that she had imagined the resemblance, that she was letting exhaustion and the strangeness of the situation make her paranoid. She pushed through the ICU doors and checked the assignment board. unsurprised to see her name next to bed 3 again, then made her way to his room, with her heart doing complicated things in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the memory of those storm-gray eyes. He was awake when she entered, propped up slightly in the bed, and he looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. The kind of exhaustion that came from refusing to let your guard down even for a moment. "You did not sleep," she said, and it was not a question. He watched her approach with that unsettling focus. "Sleep medication makes you vulnerable," he said simply, as if that explained everything. And she supposed in his world it did. She should probably lecture him about the importance of rest for seizure management, but instead she found herself saying, "Wait here," then slipping out to the break room where someone had left a fresh pot of coffee, expensive dark roast that one of the surgeons always brought in, and she poured a cup and brought it back to him, contraband and completely against protocol for a patient with an unstable neurological condition. His eyebrows rose slightly when she handed it to him, and then he smiled. A real smile that transformed his harsh features into something almost beautiful, softening all those dangerous edges. "You are breaking rules for me," he said, amusement warming his cultured voice. "Do not get used to it," she replied, but she smiled back despite herself. They fell into conversation then, careful and dancing around the real questions, him asking about her shift, her asking about his pain level, both of them aware they were talking about nothing important, because the important things were too dangerous to discuss. He shifted the conversation with surprising gentleness, asking why she became a nurse, and Eleanor found herself answering honestly, telling him about her mother, about the long illness and the hospital bills that came after, about how watching the nurses care for her mother with such compassion had made her want to do the same, about how she was still paying off that medical debt 6 years later on an ICU nurse salary. She did not mention the weekend job at the diner, the double shifts, the way she sometimes had to choose between groceries and electricity. Those details felt too raw, too exposing. He listened with an intensity that made her self-conscious, like every word mattered, like she mattered, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment before starting to say something, his expression shifting into something more personal, more open. "Eleanor," he began, but the door opened, and Dr. Wentworth swept in with a tablet, her professional mask firmly in place, test results to review. Eleanor stepped out to give them privacy. Moved to the nurse's station to chart, but she could hear Wentworth's voice through the door, muffled but audible, and then the doctor emerged and walked past her to the staff corridor, phone already to her ear. Eleanor should not have followed, but her feet moved anyway, keeping careful distance, and she heard Wentworth say the name clearly. "Montague, yes, stable for now. The seizures are controlled. You can tell him his nephew is safe." The words hit Eleanor like ice water, stealing her breath, making the fluorescent lights seem suddenly too bright. Montague. She knew that name. Everyone in this city knew that name. Whispered in the same breath as organized crime and territory wars and bodies that disappeared. Alexander Montague ran half the criminal enterprises on the East Coast, controlled drugs and weapons and gambling, and people who crossed him ended up dead or wishing they were. The kind patient whose hand she had held, who had smiled at her over contraband coffee, was one of the most dangerous men alive. Her hands were shaking as she walked back toward his room, her mind racing through every interaction, recontextualizing everything, the armed guards and the expensive clothes and the refusal to provide real identification, all of it suddenly making terrible sense. She stood outside his door for a moment, trying to compose herself. But when she entered, she knew her face betrayed her because his expression changed instantly, going from relaxed to predatory alert in a heartbeat, his gray eyes locking onto hers and seeing everything, the knowledge and the fear she could not quite hide. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was gentle but carried that edge of command that made it impossible to ignore. "Would you close the door, please?" She stood frozen for a heartbeat, her mind screaming at her to run, to get away from this man who was so much more dangerous than she had imagined. But she knew with cold certainty that running was pointless, that if Alexander Montague wanted to stop her, she would not make it past the threshold. So she turned with hands that trembled visibly and pushed the door closed, hearing the quiet click of the latch like a verdict. When she turned back, he was watching her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see through every defense she had, and he gestured to the chair beside his bed, an invitation that felt like an order. "Sit," he said, "please." The please softened it, but not enough to disguise what this was. A conversation she could not escape. She sat on the very edge of the chair, spine rigid, hands clasped in her lap to hide their shaking. "You know who I am," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Eleanor nodded once, not trusting her voice. "Alexander Montague," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "And yes, everything you are thinking right now is probably true. I run criminal enterprises up and down the East Coast. I control territory and business that exists outside the law. I have done things that would make you look at me with horror." She found her voice then, barely above a whisper. "Have you killed people?" He did not flinch from the question, did not try to soften it. "Yes," he said simply, and the honesty of it was somehow worse than a lie would have been. She should be terrified, should be planning how to get away from him, but instead she found herself thinking about the way he had looked at her when she held his hand through the seizures, the gratitude and vulnerability in his eyes, the gentleness in his voice when he thanked her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you would figure it out anyway," he said. "You are too intelligent not to. And I prefer honesty between us." That word hung in the air, between, with all its implications of connection and intimacy, making her breath catch. "The seizure started 3 months ago," he continued, leaning back against the pillows with obvious exhaustion. "In my world you cannot show weakness. Weakness means death. It means your enemies circle and your allies start calculating whether they would be better served by your second in command. It means everything you have built crumbles." His jaw tightened. "I came to this hospital because it is neutral territory, because Dr. Wentworth is on my payroll and will keep her mouth shut, because I needed help but could not afford to show how compromised I am." He paused, something shifting in his expression. "But I did not account for you, Eleanor. For someone who would actually care rather than just follow orders for money." She tried to process this, the confirmation of everything she had feared, but also the raw honesty in his voice, the way he was trusting her with information that could destroy him. Before she could respond, before she could even begin to sort through the tangle of fear and fascination in her chest, his body went rigid and she recognized the pre-seizure signs instantly. She moved without thinking, pure instinct and training overriding everything else, rising from the chair and supporting him as the seizure took hold, 53 seconds of violence that she guided him through with gentle hands and soft words. "You are safe. I have you. Just breathe. Let it pass." When it ended, he did not look away as he usually did not try to hide the vulnerability. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on hers with something raw and unguarded in their depths, something that looked almost like hope, and the moment stretched between them heavy with meaning. The door burst open and James Sinclair stood there, his face grim. "We have a problem," he said. "Redmond's men were just spotted 3 blocks from the hospital." James moved instantly into crisis mode, his weapon already drawn as he strode into the room with the controlled urgency of a man who had handled threats before, telling Alexander they needed to move him now, immediately, that Redmond's men being 3 blocks away meant they had maybe 20 minutes before this hospital room became a kill zone. Alexander started to sit up, his body tensing despite the obvious exhaustion, but Eleanor stepped between them and heard her voice come out sharp and authoritative in a way that surprised even herself. "He is not stable for transport," she said, looking directly at James even though her pulse hammered in her throat. "He just had a seizure, his neurological status is compromised, and moving him now could trigger another episode or worse." James looked at her like she was insane. "With respect, miss, if we stay here, he will be dead," which seems worse than another seizure. Alexander swung his legs over the side of the bed, clearly intending to prove he could move. But the moment he tried to stand, his knees buckled, and Eleanor caught him, felt the tremor in his muscles, the way his weight sagged against her. "He is not stable," she repeated, meeting Alexander's eyes this time, seeing frustration and shame war across his features. "We need another option." The silence stretched taut for 3 heartbeats before Alexander spoke, his voice rough but carrying absolute command despite his physical weakness. "Fortify this room," he told James. "Bring our people in. Lock down this floor. We move tomorrow when I can actually walk." James started to protest, but Alexander cut him off with a look that reminded Eleanor exactly who he was, what he was capable of, even diminished. "That is an order," Alexander said quietly, and James nodded once and left, already pulling out his phone. The door closed, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air thicker, adrenaline beginning to drain from Eleanor's system and leave behind a shaky awareness of just how much danger she was in, how completely her life had tilted off its axis in the span of minutes. She helped Alexander back into the bed, checking his pulse with professional efficiency, even though her hands wanted to tremble. He caught her wrist gently when she reached for the blood pressure cuff, not restraining but stopping her, making her look at him. "You should request a different patient assignment," he said, his gray eyes searching her face. "This is not your fight, Eleanor. You could walk away right now and be safe." She should say yes. Should run as far from this man and his violent world as possible. "No," she heard herself say instead, the words simple and final. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, something that looked almost like wonder. "Why?" he asked, and she could not articulate an answer, could not explain the pull she felt toward him, the way his vulnerability had wrapped around her heart, despite every logical reason to be terrified. He reached for her hand then, not grabbing as he had that first night, but offering, palm up, a choice. She looked at his hand, at the scars on his knuckles that spoke of violence, at the slight tremor from the seizure after effects, and she took it, laced her fingers through his. The moment stretched between them, heavy with understanding neither of them could voice. "My name is Alexander," he said quietly. "Not Montague, not the boss, just Alexander, and I am trusting you with that." "I know," she whispered. "I prefer it to John." That small smile again, the one that transformed his dangerous face into something almost gentle. She asked him then about his neurological care, whether he had seen specialists, whether he was on proper medication protocols, and he admitted with obvious reluctance that he had been treating the seizures like an enemy to defeat through sheer will rather than a medical condition requiring management. She scolded him with facts about seizure disorders and brain trauma and medication compliance, falling into the familiar safety of clinical knowledge, and he watched her with an expression that was equal parts amused and something warmer, something that made her breath catch. "You are brave and foolish," he said when she finished. "I know," she replied. He kept holding her hand for several seconds longer than necessary before finally releasing it, his fingers trailing across her palm. That night, Eleanor lay in her own bed, in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through everything she knew about the Montague crime family, the stories she had heard whispered in break rooms and reported in careful language by news anchors who knew better than to be too specific. Violent, yes, but also with a reputation for protecting their territory, for a certain code of honor, for taking care of their own. She was rationalizing, she knew, finding excuses for the inexcusable, but she could not forget the gentleness in his voice when he thanked her, the vulnerability in his eyes during the seizures, the way he had trusted her with his real name. Her phone shattered the 2 a.m. silence with its shrill ring, the hospital ID flashing on the screen, and the charge nurse voice was tight with stress as she said, "You need to come in now. Something has happened with your patient in room 3. Eleanor threw on clothes without thinking, her hands clumsy with adrenaline and fear as she grabbed her keys and ran to her car. The city streets empty and eerie at 2 in the morning, streetlights casting pools of orange that her headlights cut through as she drove too fast toward the hospital, her mind conjuring terrible scenarios. Alexander bleeding out, another seizure that lasted too long, Redmond's men finishing what they started. She pulled into the hospital parking garage and saw it immediately. The crime scene tape cordoning off a section near the staff entrance, 2 police cruisers with lights still flashing, and her stomach dropped as she parked badly and ran toward the main entrance. Her nurse badge getting her past the security guard, who tried to tell her something about an incident. The ICU floor looked like a war zone, or at least the preparation for one. 4 men in dark suits stationed outside Alexander's room, all of them radiating the kind of controlled violence that made her steps falter, and James Sinclair was there talking in clipped tones to someone on his phone, his weapon visible in a shoulder holster that he made no attempt to hide. He saw her approaching and ended his call abruptly, stepping into her path with an expression that was equal parts relief and suspicion. Telling her he needed to search her bag before she could go in, and Eleanor wanted to protest the absurdity of it, but the hard set of his jaw told her this was not negotiable. She handed over her purse and submitted to the quick, efficient search that felt invasive and necessary all at once, James pulling out her phone and wallet and keys and chapstick with methodical thoroughness before handing it all back with a curt nod. The security guard was shot, James said as he opened the door for her, not fatally but close. Redmond made his move in the parking garage about an hour ago. We got your man out of the line of fire, but not before things got messy. Eleanor pushed into the room and the sight of Alexander made her breath catch. He was sitting up in bed rigid with fury, his face pale and tight with pain. And there was an intensity in his eyes that was all predator, all mafia boss, no trace of the vulnerable man who had held her hand. But then he saw her, and something shifted, visible relief flooding his features for just a heartbeat before he mastered it, his expression smoothing into careful neutrality that did not quite hide the emotion underneath. "James," he said without looking away from Eleanor, "give us the room." James started to object, but Alexander cut him off with a single look, and the door closed, leaving them alone in the false privacy of a hospital room that now felt like a fortress. She moved to his bedside on instinct, her nursing assessment already cataloging details, the way he held himself too still on the left side, the slight tremor in his right hand, the sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool room. "Are you hurt?" she asked, keeping her voice professional, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. He told her he was fine, but it was a terrible lie. She could see it in the tightness around his mouth. And when she reached for the call button to get Dr. Wentworth, he caught her wrist gently but firmly, saying no more doctors right now, just you. Eleanor saw the blood then, a dark stain spreading slowly through his shirt on the left side just below his ribs, and her professional calm shattered into sharp fear. "You are bleeding," she said, already reaching to lift his shirt, and he let her, watching her face as she exposed the bandage that someone had applied hastily over what was clearly a gunshot wound, the gauze already soaked through. "It is from before," he said quietly. "2 weeks ago, minor. It was healing, but I moved wrong during the chaos tonight and tore it open again." She looked at him with dawning horror, understanding what he was not saying, that he had let someone get close enough to shoot him because he had seized at the wrong moment, because his condition had made him vulnerable, and her heart clenched with an emotion she could not name. Eleanor cleaned the wound with supplies from the room, her hands steady despite the trembling in her core, applying fresh bandages with professional efficiency but unprofessional tenderness, hyper-aware of his eyes on her face, the way his breathing changed when her fingers brushed undamaged skin. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You could have stayed away, stayed safe. Let someone else deal with this." She realized with strange clarity that she had never considered not coming, that the moment her phone rang she was already moving toward him, and the truth of that should terrify her, but instead it settled over her, like inevitability. "Someone has to keep you alive," she said, meeting his eyes as she secured the final piece of tape, "since you seem determined to get yourself killed." He caught her wrist when she finished, not restraining but holding, his thumb finding her pulse point, and he pulled her closer with gentle, inexorable pressure until she was standing between his knees, close enough to feel the heat of his body, to see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked, searching her face with an intensity that stripped away pretense. "Yes," she answered honestly, "but not the way you mean, not afraid you will hurt me. Afraid of what I feel when I am near you, afraid of how much I want to stay." The moment stretched between them electric and fragile, his hand sliding from her wrist to her palm, their fingers tangling together, and she saw the same want in his eyes that she felt burning in her chest, saw the war between his desire and his conscience, and then his body went rigid, and she recognized the signs. The seizure took him, and she guided him through it with practiced hands and soft reassurances. "You are safe. I have you. Breathe. Just breathe." 47 seconds that felt eternal, and when it passed he was disoriented and vulnerable in a way that broke something open inside her. "Angel," he whispered, still half lost in the post-seizure confusion, "my angel," and she knew he would not remember saying it, but she would carry those words like a brand. Dr. Wentworth opened the door without knocking, her expression tight with stress, as she told them the police were demanding to question the patient about the shooting in the parking garage. Alexander transformed the moment Dr. Wentworth finished speaking, his entire demeanor shifting from vulnerable patient to cold, commanding authority in the span of a single breath, his voice dropping into a tone that was pure, calculated power as he told the doctor to handle it. He was medically unable to answer questions at this time, and Dr. Wentworth nodded once with the crisp efficiency of someone who had followed such orders before, and disappeared through the door. James entered less than 30 seconds later, with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase, and Eleanor watched the machinery of Alexander's criminal empire manifest in real time, the lawyer already pulling out documents and speaking in low, urgent tones about procedure and rights and strategic delays, James coordinating with someone on his phone about securing the floor and controlling information flow. She stood back against the wall and observed Alexander command his people from a hospital bed, his authority absolute despite the IV line still in his arm, and the hospital gown that should have diminished him but somehow did not. And she understood with crystalline clarity that this was who he really was, beneath the vulnerability she had witnessed, dangerous and powerful and utterly untouchable by normal laws or consequences. The lawyer left with instructions, and James was updating Alexander on security positions when his body went rigid mid-sentence, the seizure taking him without warning. And Eleanor moved on pure instinct, catching him as he convulsed, supporting his head and checking his airway while James stood frozen in the doorway, and she guided Alexander through it with soft words and steady hands, 53 seconds that felt eternal until his muscles relaxed and his eyes opened, confused and seeking, his hand reaching automatically for hers. The duality of him stunned her breathless. This man who could command an empire one moment and needed her comfort the next, monster and man existing in the same body, and she held his hand while his breathing steadied and awareness returned to his gaze. A detective arrived 10 minutes later, middle-aged with tired eyes and a badge clipped to his belt, asking questions about the shooting in the parking garage and what Alexander might know about it. And Alexander responded with perfect polite bewilderment. Just a patient recovering from a medical condition. No knowledge of any violence. Surely there were security cameras that would show he never left his room. The detective turned his attention to Eleanor then, asking how long she had been caring for this patient and what she knew about his visitors, and she answered truthfully that she knew nothing beyond her medical duties, her voice steady even though her pulse hammered, and the detective studied her face with the practiced assessment of someone who had interviewed countless witnesses and told her quietly that she should be careful about the kind of man she was protecting. "I am protecting my patient," she said, meeting his eyes, "not passing moral judgment on his life. That is not my job." And even as she spoke the words, she knew it was a lie, knew that she had already passed judgment, and found Alexander worthy of her loyalty, despite everything she knew he had done. The detective left with a warning look and a business card he pressed into her hand, and when the door closed, Alexander thanked her in a voice rough with emotion, telling her that she could have revealed how vulnerable the seizures made him, could have told them about the timing and triggers, and if his enemies knew that information, they would use it to strike when he was defenseless. The weight of that realization settled over Eleanor like a physical thing, understanding that she held his life in her hands, not just medically, but strategically, that her knowledge of his condition was a weapon that could destroy him, and he knew it too. She could see it in his eyes as he told her he was trusting her with everything, his life and his empire and his secrets, all of it resting on her discretion. The trust terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, a responsibility she had never asked for but found herself accepting. Alexander said he needed to leave the hospital today, despite medical advice. This place was too exposed, too many access points and witnesses. He had a secure location where they could continue treatment. And then he looked at her with careful neutrality and asked if she would come with him, continue his care in a private setting where he could actually rest without armed guards and police detectives. Eleanor felt the question land like a crossroads, understanding that saying yes meant crossing a line from which there was no return, entering his world fully and completely, leaving behind the safety of professional distance and plausible deniability. She hesitated, her mind racing through implications and consequences, and Alexander saw her uncertainty and told her it was fine. He would find another nurse, someone from his organization, his voice carefully empty of pressure, but his eyes holding a silent plea that broke something in her chest. "Yes," she heard herself say, before she had consciously decided, the word simple and irrevocable, "I will come with you." Everything moved with disorienting speed after Eleanor spoke that single word, yes, Alexander making calls from his hospital bed, while James coordinated logistics with military precision, and within 30 minutes she was being told she had 1 hour to go home and pack essentials for a week, maybe longer. The timeline deliberately vague in a way that made her stomach clench with anxiety, and something that felt dangerously like anticipation. James drove her in a black SUV with windows tinted so dark she could barely see out, the vehicle armored she realized when she touched the door, and he said nothing during the 20-minute drive to her modest apartment building, just waited with the engine running while she ran upstairs with legs that felt unsteady beneath her. Her roommate Tessa was awake despite the early hour, sitting at their cramped kitchen table with coffee and her laptop, and Eleanor manufactured a lie with an ease that disturbed her, saying she had been offered a live-in nursing case for a wealthy patient, good money, just a week or so. And Tessa accepted it without question, because Eleanor had taken extra shifts and odd jobs for years to pay down her mother's medical debt. She threw clothes into a duffel bag without really seeing what she grabbed, adding her laptop and phone charger and the few medical reference books she kept at home, and her hands trembled as she zipped the bag closed, understanding that she was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The drive to Alexander's estate took 40 minutes heading north out of the city into areas where properties were measured in acres instead of square feet. And when James turned through iron gates that opened automatically and continued up a tree-lined drive, Eleanor felt her breath catch at the scope of wealth on display. The mansion that emerged from the landscaping was something from a different world than hers, all stone and glass and architectural statements that probably cost more than she would earn in her lifetime. James parked near a side entrance and led her through hallways decorated with art that looked museum quality, up a curved staircase to the second floor, and he opened a door to reveal a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in soft grays and creams. With an attached bathroom, she glimpsed through an open door and medical supplies already arranged on a desk near the window. "That door connects to his suite," James said, nodding toward another door she had not noticed. "Medical access only. There is a panic button by the bed that brings armed response in under 30 seconds." And his tone suggested she should actually use it if needed, that the danger was real and present. Alexander arrived 20 minutes later in a different vehicle. She heard voices in the hallway, and then he was there, moving carefully, but under his own power, and in his own space. He seemed transformed, more formidable somehow, the hospital vulnerability replaced by the authority of a man in his domain. He dismissed James with a quiet word and turned his full attention to Eleanor, asking if the room was acceptable, if she needed anything. His courtesy perfect, but his eyes holding an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She followed him through the connecting door into his suite, and the intimacy of it struck her immediately. This was his private space, all dark wood and masculine comfort, the massive bed dominating one wall, and he was showing her where he kept his medications, the schedule he had been following, the emergency protocols, all business, but she could feel the awareness between them like a physical presence. He showed her the panic button mounted discreetly by the bed, the secure phone line that connected directly to James, and explained that very few people were allowed in this part of the house, his inner sanctum, and she understood what he was not saying, that bringing her here meant something, meant trust and vulnerability and a level of access that he granted almost no one. She was checking his vital signs with her portable equipment when he caught her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles as he thanked her properly for coming, for trusting him enough to leave her life and enter his. And Eleanor was acutely aware that they were alone in his bedroom, with no hospital rules or watching eyes, just the two of them and the dangerous pull between them. He seemed to realize it at the same moment and released her hand quickly, stepping back to a professional distance, and he finished showing her the suite with careful neutrality. But his eyes kept returning to her face, lingering on her mouth, and she felt the weight of his attention like a touch. That night, Eleanor lay in the unfamiliar bed in the attached room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence of the massive house, so different from her apartment with its thin walls and street noise. And she must have fallen asleep eventually, because she woke suddenly to sounds of distress from the other room, harsh breathing and a crash that sent her stumbling through the connecting door in her sleep shirt and bare feet. Alexander was seizing on the floor beside his bed, must have been trying to reach the bathroom when it hit, and terror flooded her system cold and sharp as she dropped to her knees beside him, checking his airway and supporting his head, noting the blood already pooling from where he had struck the nightstand on his way down. The seizure lasted 71 seconds but felt eternal, and when it finally released him, he was disoriented and combative in the post-ictal confusion, not recognizing her, trying to push her away when she attempted to check his head wound, and she had to use his first name over and over. "Alexander, it is Eleanor, you are safe, you had a seizure," until recognition slowly filtered back into his eyes, along with shame so profound it made her chest ache. He reached for her then with shaking hands and pulled her down to sit on the edge of the bed where he had managed to half collapse. And he did something she had never seen him do before, let himself break, pressing his forehead against her shoulder in complete surrender as he whispered that he could not do this anymore, could not keep fighting his own body while his empire crumbled and his enemies circled. Eleanor froze at Dr. Hastings' words, watching Alexander's face close down into that controlled mask he wore when receiving unacceptable news. And the neurologist continued speaking in clinical tones about brain damage and cascading failures and quality of life, terms that felt obscene when applied to the vital, dangerous man sitting across from him. Alexander asked questions with detached precision, as though discussing someone else's condition. What were his options? What was the timeline? Could he continue functioning at his current capacity? And Hastings answered honestly that without significant lifestyle changes and aggressive treatment, the prognosis was poor. 6 months perhaps before cognitive decline became noticeable, a year before he would be unable to manage complex decisions, and Eleanor watched Alexander process his own death sentence with the same cold calculation he probably applied to business problems. After Hastings left with promises to send medication protocols and follow up in 48 hours, silence filled the study, heavy and suffocating, Alexander staring at the medical papers on his desk as though they were written in a language he did not recognize, and Eleanor wanted to touch him but did not know if he would accept comfort now or if he had retreated too far behind his walls. He spoke without looking at her, voice carefully empty, told her she should leave now while she still could. He would pay her well for her discretion and arrange transportation wherever she wanted to go. This was not her fight, and she had no obligation to stay for the ugly ending. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she moved without thinking, crossing to his desk and slamming her palm down on the surface hard enough to make him look up, startled. "You do not get to make that choice for me," she told him with fury vibrating through every word. "You do not get to push me away because you are scared. I am scared too, but I am staying and you cannot stop me." Something cracked in his expression, the control shattering to reveal raw, desperate hope beneath, and he reached for her hand on the desk, covering it with both of his, asking why she would stay for this, for watching him deteriorate and lose himself piece by piece. "Because you are not just your power," she said, moving around the desk to stand in front of him, "because I have seen who you are beneath the empire and the violence, and I am not walking away from that person." He pulled her closer, hands sliding to her hips, looking up at her with naked emotion that made her breath catch, and he asked what she saw when she looked at him, what possibly made him worth this. She touched his face, tracing the hard line of his jaw, and told him she saw a man who protected his people, who was gentle when he could have been cruel, who trusted her with his vulnerability, even when trust did not come easy. And maybe he had done terrible things, but she was choosing to believe he could also do beautiful things if given the chance. Alexander pulled her down into his lap in one smooth motion, burying his face against her neck, and she felt him shaking again, this man who commanded an empire breaking apart in her arms, and she held him while he fought for composure, her fingers threading through his hair in soothing repetition. "I do not know how to be weak," he whispered against her skin. "I do not know how to let people see me fail." "Then learn," she whispered back. "Let me help you learn. You do not have to carry this alone anymore." He lifted his head to look at her, searching her face as though memorizing it, and then he kissed her with devastating tenderness, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious and breakable, and she kissed him back, pouring everything she could not yet say into the contact, promises and hope and terrifying fragile trust, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the intimate space between them where the rest of the world could not reach. Eleanor watched James's face drain of color when he delivered the news about the bounty, a sum so staggering it would tempt even loyal men to consider betrayal, and Alexander's expression went cold and hard as stone, immediately issuing orders to lock down the estate, no one in or out without his direct authorization, and within minutes the mansion transformed into a fortress, security personnel appearing from nowhere to take positions at every entrance, every window, the machinery of his empire clicking into place with ruthless efficiency. Alexander called an emergency meeting in his study, and Eleanor stood in the doorway watching as 8 men filed in, hard-faced and dangerous, the kind of men who made violence their profession, and she saw Alexander transform before her eyes into the crime lord the city feared, standing behind his desk despite the tremor in his hands that only she seemed to notice, laying out strategy with cold precision, discussing retaliatory strikes against Redmond's operations, defensive positions, and supply lines, and contingency plans that involved words like acceptable casualties. This was the real Alexander Montague, she reminded herself, the man who commanded an empire built on blood and fear, who made decisions that ended lives without hesitation, and she should be terrified, But instead she found herself watching for the signs she had learned to recognize, the slight glazing of his eyes, the way his left hand gripped the desk edge, the pause mid-sentence that lasted a fraction too long. He swayed suddenly and caught himself against the table, trying to pass it off as leaning forward to examine papers. But Eleanor saw what the others missed, saw the pre-seizure aura taking hold, and she moved without thinking, crossing the room in 4 strides to reach him just as his knees buckled, and the seizure hit with devastating force. She supported his weight as he went down, guiding him to the floor so he would not crack his skull on the desk, and she cradled his head in her lap while his body convulsed, aware of 8 pairs of eyes watching their untouchable boss reduced to helpless vulnerability. Aware that she had just revealed his greatest weakness to men whose loyalty might not survive the knowledge. The seizure lasted 53 seconds, but the silence afterward felt longer, heavy and dangerous. And then James moved first, stepping forward to block the view of the others, his voice hard as iron as he declared that what they had just witnessed never happened, that anyone who spoke of it would answer to him personally. And one by one, the other men nodded their agreement, most with conviction. But Eleanor saw the calculation in 2 sets of eyes, saw them weighing Alexander's vulnerability against the bounty on his head. Alexander came back to awareness slowly, his eyes finding Eleanor's face first with confusion, then recognition, then shame, and she helped him sit up despite his attempt to push her away, her hand firm on his shoulder as she checked his pupils and pulse while his men watched. And she saw him realize what had happened, that his carefully maintained facade had cracked wide open in front of his top lieutenants. He dismissed them all with a wave of his hand that was not quite steady, everyone except James, and when the door closed behind the last man, Alexander told his second, in a voice rough with exhaustion, that they needed to discuss succession planning, that he could no longer guarantee his ability to lead effectively with this condition, and James refused to hear it, insisted they would eliminate Redmond and Alexander would recover, but Alexander cut him off, saying this was not about Redmond. This was about the fact that he had just seized in front of his command structure, and they all saw him vulnerable, and some of them were already calculating whether the bounty was worth the risk. His eyes found Eleanor as he spoke, and she saw defeat there, raw and terrible, saw him accepting that his empire was crumbling and taking him down with it, and something in her chest cracked at the sight of this powerful, dangerous man, surrendering to inevitability. After James left them alone in the study, Eleanor approached Alexander where he stood staring out the window at the grounds where men with rifles patrolled the perimeter in rotation patterns designed to prevent exactly what had just happened, and she placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension coiled through every muscle, telling him they needed to discuss what Hastings had said about treatment protocols and medication adjustments. But he cut her off with a bitter laugh, asking what was the point when Redmond was closing in and half his organization had now seen him vulnerable enough to question his leadership. She turned him to face her with more force than she knew she possessed, telling him the point was that she was not giving up on him even if he had given up on himself. And he looked at her with such raw conflict in his expression, want and resignation warring together, before he caught her face between his hands and kissed her with desperate intensity that stole her breath and made her forget for one perfect moment about seizures and death sentences and bounties. When they broke apart, she saw the fear beneath his desire, the way he was already trying to pull back emotionally even as he held her physically, and she recognized it for what it was, his attempt to protect her by pushing her away before the inevitable end. She told him she was staying and he needed to stop trying to make that decision for her. And he asked what happened when his enemies realized she mattered to him, when they came for her to hurt him. Could she live with being a target just by standing at his side? Eleanor had not considered that angle, and felt ice slip down her spine at the thought of men like those who had breached the grounds tonight coming for her specifically. But she looked at Alexander and saw the man who had trusted her with his deepest vulnerability, who had broken apart in her arms and let her see his fear, and she knew her answer even as it terrified her. Before she could speak, his phone rang and James was reporting that the captured men had talked under interrogation. Redmond was planning a major offensive within 48 hours, multiple targets including the estate and Alexander's legitimate business fronts, designed to flush him out or trap him here. And Alexander's expression went cold and tactical as he issued counter-orders, mobilizing his entire organization for war. Eleanor watched him transform again into the crime lord who commanded an empire, his voice hard and certain as he discussed strategy and acceptable losses. And she understood with crystalline clarity that this was the reality of his world, that violence was not an aberration, but the foundation everything else was built on. He ended the call and looked at her, clearly expecting to see horror or rejection in her face, and she knew he was giving her one more chance to walk away, to choose safety over whatever this dangerous, impossible thing was growing between them. Instead, she asked what he needed her to do, how she could help, and watched shock and something that looked painfully like hope flash across his expression before he told her the most important thing she could do was keep him functional through what was coming, that he needed to be able to lead for the next 48 hours without seizing in front of more of his people. And she promised him she would do everything in her power to make that happen, even knowing the stress of impending war made seizures more likely, not less. Eleanor watched Alexander's face drain of color at Hastings' prognosis, the kind of fear she had never seen from him before. Not when facing armed intruders or discussing his enemies, but now confronting the reality that his own body was betraying him in ways more dangerous than any rival crime lord. And Hastings continued with clinical precision that the traumatic brain injury had created a lesion in the temporal lobe that was progressively worsening, that without proper treatment and significant lifestyle changes, Alexander would not survive the year, regardless of what Redmond or any other enemy did. Alexander dismissed the doctor with cold courtesy that barely masked his rage and despair, and when they were alone, he stood at the window staring out at his empire with rigid shoulders, telling Eleanor in a voice like gravel that she should leave now while she could still walk away clean, that he was a dead man walking, and she deserved better than watching him deteriorate. She crossed to him and placed her hand on his back, feeling the tension coiled through every muscle, telling him that Hastings had also said treatment was possible, that with proper medication and stress reduction, the progression could be halted or even reversed. And Alexander laughed bitterly, asking how exactly he was supposed to reduce stress when Redmond was launching an assault in 36 hours, and half his organization was calculating whether the bounty was worth betrayal. Eleanor moved to face him, forcing him to meet her eyes, and told him with more certainty than she felt that he needed to make a choice, either commit to treatment and do what was necessary to survive, or give up now and let the seizures kill him. But he could not have it both ways. Could not lead his empire into war while his brain was actively destroying itself. He stared at her with conflict written across every line of his face, the warrior and the man at odds, and she saw the moment something shifted in his expression, resignation giving way to determination, and he told her quietly that if he was going to survive, he needed to end this with Redmond permanently, could not spend the next months looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next attack to trigger another seizure. She understood what he was saying, that he was choosing to fight one more time so he could have peace after. And she asked what he needed from her, knowing she was complicit now in whatever violence was coming. Alexander reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with surprising tenderness for a man planning war, and told her he needed her to keep him stable through the next 2 days, needed her to monitor him constantly and catch the seizures before they happened in front of his people, needed her trust that what he was about to do was necessary, even if it made her see him as the monster he truly was. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, his scarred knuckles against her smooth skin, the physical manifestation of how different their worlds were, and she knew she should walk away now before she was in too deep to ever surface. But when she met his eyes and saw the vulnerability beneath the steel, she heard herself promise to stay with him through whatever came next, sealing her fate with his. Eleanor spent the next 30 hours in a state of hypervigilance she had never experienced even during her most demanding hospital shifts, shadowing Alexander through every meeting and phone call and strategic session as he prepared his organization for the confrontation with Redmond that was now less than 18 hours away. She watched for the telltale signs that preceded his seizures, the subtle changes in his pupils and the way his jaw would tighten and his hands would curl into fists without his awareness. And twice she caught the warnings early enough to guide him away from his men before the episodes hit, holding him through the convulsions in private spaces while whispering reassurances that he probably could not hear but that she needed to say anyway. James had looked at her with something approaching gratitude after the second time, understanding that she was the only thing standing between Alexander and complete exposure of his vulnerability at the worst possible moment. Between the medical crises, Eleanor found herself drawn deeper into the machinery of Alexander's empire, listening as he coordinated with his captains about weapon deliveries and safe houses and extraction routes, speaking in a language of violence that should have horrified her, but instead revealed the chess-like strategy required to survive in his world. She realized he was not merely planning an attack, but constructing an elaborate trap, using himself as bait to draw Redmond into a location of Alexander's choosing where the terrain and timing favored his forces. And the cold brilliance of it was somehow mesmerizing even as she recognized the moral abyss it represented. During a brief respite near midnight, Alexander found her in his study, staring at security monitors that showed armed men patrolling the grounds in overlapping patterns, and he came to stand beside her close enough that she could feel the heat of him, asking quietly if she wanted him to arrange transport away from the estate before tomorrow's operation. Eleanor turned to face him and saw exhaustion carved into every line of his face, along with something that looked like resignation, as if he had already accepted that she would choose safety over him. And the assumption stung more than it should have given, that leaving was the rational choice any sane person would make. She told him she was staying, and watched disbelief flash across his expression before he caught her face between his hands, with a gentleness that contradicted the violence he had been planning all day, searching her eyes as if trying to understand what madness made her willing to stand beside a man preparing for war. He kissed her with desperate tenderness that tasted like goodbye, even though she had just promised to stay, and she understood he was trying to memorize her in case tomorrow ended the way these things often did in his world. And instead of fear, she felt fury that he still saw himself as already dead. She broke the kiss and told him with more force than she intended that he was going to survive tomorrow and the day after, and all the days beyond, because she had not thrown away her entire life to watch him martyr himself in some misguided attempt at redemption. And he stared at her as if she had struck him before pulling her tight against his chest, and she felt him shaking with either laughter or something closer to tears. Alexander stared at the wall above Eleanor's head for a long moment after Hastings departed, processing the death sentence that had just been delivered with clinical detachment, and she watched him cycle through emotions that flickered across his face too quickly to name, before settling into cold resolve that frightened her more than his earlier despair. He stood abruptly, swaying only slightly, and told her he needed to make preparations, that she should rest because the next 24 hours would determine everything. But Eleanor caught his arm and demanded to know what he was planning with enough force that he actually stopped and looked at her with something like surprise. She told him point blank that if he was considering some suicidal final stand against Redmond, she would sedate him right now and call an ambulance regardless of the consequences. And he stared at her for 3 heartbeats before his expression softened into something achingly tender, and he cupped her face with both hands, telling her that he was not planning to die, but rather the opposite, that he intended to end this war permanently so he could have the luxury of focusing on treatment without watching over his shoulder for the knife. Eleanor searched his eyes for the lie, but found only grim determination and something that looked dangerously like hope, and she asked what exactly ending it permanently meant. needing to hear him say it even though she already knew. Alexander did not flinch from the question, told her he was going to meet with Redmond under flag of truce, on neutral ground with witnesses, and offer terms that would either result in peace or eliminate the threat entirely. And Eleanor felt ice flood her veins because she understood the subtext, that he would be walking into a situation where Redmond could easily violate the truce, and Alexander would be vulnerable in ways his enemy did not even fully comprehend. She started to protest, but he silenced her with a kiss that tasted like goodbye and desperation, and promises he might not live to keep. And when he pulled back, he told her he was not asking her permission, because this was not her world or her choice. But he wanted her to understand that everything he was about to do was so he could have a chance at the life she made him believe was possible. The words hit her like a physical blow, the weight of being his reason for fighting to survive, rather than simply existing until the seizures or his enemies took him. And she realized he had given her power over him that was more dangerous than any weapon, the power to make him want to live. Eleanor grabbed his shirt and pulled him back down to her, kissing him with all the fear and fury and fierce protectiveness that had been building since the moment she first held his hand through a seizure in that hospital room. And she told him against his mouth that he better come back to her because she did not survive nursing school and 6 years of ICU hell to lose her patient now. Alexander laughed. The sound startled out of him, and promised her he would do everything in his power to survive, and she had to be satisfied with that, even though it felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. Morning came too soon, and Eleanor had barely slept, checking on Alexander every hour through the connecting door to find him either staring at the ceiling or pretending to sleep, and she knew he was running scenarios through his mind about the meeting with Redmond that was now only 9 hours away. She brought him breakfast that he barely touched and new medication that Hastings had prescribed, watching him swallow the pills with water and wondering if they would even have time to take effect before he walked into what might be an execution dressed as negotiation. James arrived at 7 a.m. with detailed plans for the meet, a restaurant in neutral territory that Redmond had agreed to, public enough that open violence would bring police attention, but private enough that either side could arrange an accident if they chose, and Eleanor felt sick listening to them discuss backup plans and exit strategies as if they were planning a business merger instead of a confrontation that could end in death. Alexander was calm and focused in a way that terrified her more than if he had shown fear, this cold calculation that reminded her he had survived in his world for years before she ever held his hand through a seizure. And she realized with sudden clarity that part of him welcomed the danger, because at least it was something he could fight, unlike the invisible enemy attacking his brain. She caught his arm when James stepped out to take a call and demanded to know what he really expected to happen at this meeting, needing him to be honest with her even if the truth was ugly. Alexander looked at her for a long moment before admitting that Redmond would either accept the terms being offered, a division of territory that gave him face-saving gains while securing Alexander's core interests, or he would attempt to kill him at the table, betting that Alexander's security would be too slow to respond. And either way, the uncertainty would end today. Eleanor asked what happened if he had a seizure during the meeting and watched Alexander's expression shudder completely, the vulnerability disappearing behind the crime boss mask. And he told her flatly that then Redmond would kill him and the war would be over with a clear victor. The casual acceptance of his own death as an acceptable outcome made her want to scream or hit him or kiss him until he remembered he had reasons to survive, and instead she told him with forced calm that she was coming with him to the meeting. Alexander refused immediately, said absolutely not, it was too dangerous, and he would not risk her. But Eleanor stood her ground and pointed out that he needed medical supervision given yesterday's severe seizure and the medication adjustment, that having a nurse present would actually provide cover for any absence or confusion if his condition flared, and she watched him process the logic even as he clearly hated it. James returned and surprisingly supported her argument when Alexander appealed to him, noting that bringing Eleanor openly would signal confidence and normalcy, while her medical presence would explain any behavioral irregularities. And after several minutes of tense discussion, Alexander finally agreed, but only if she followed every security instruction without question. Eleanor nodded her acceptance,